In 1988, Nirvana recorded their first single, a cover of Shocking Blue's Love Buzz. Although not his first choice, Kurt Cobain, the band's frontman, was thrilled by the end product. So thrilled, he wasn't content with just hearing it on wax. Instead, he dropped off a copy at KCMU, a local college radio station, waited a few hours, called them on a payphone, and requested they play it. Then, after another half hour of waiting in the car of his girlfriend Tracy Miranda, they did. It was amazing. I never thought I'd get to that point. I just thought I'd be in a band and maybe make a demo. But once I got a taste of it, I really thought it was cool, and I thought I would definitely like to hear my future recordings on the radio, and be able to pay my rent with this band. It would be really great. It made us step up mentally to another level where it was a reality that we could actually live off of this. This was just one of many events that cemented 1988 as a huge year for Nirvana. Beyond the fact that it was the year they chose the name Nirvana, Kurt and bassist Krist Novoselic had finally settled on a drummer they could tolerate, Chad Channing, and found a label that could support them, Subpop Records. That last one was a little odd, though. Kurt had spent most of the year sending demo tapes to any record company with an inbox, including 20 to Touch and Go, only for Subpop to approach them basically out of nowhere. Formed just 2 years prior and run by Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman, it was a small label that had quickly made a name for itself by harnessing the power of Seattle's underground music. As Poneman would call it, a very aggressive, very raw form of guitar-driven rock and roll. Grunge, essentially. And with plenty of talent in Mudhoney, Tad, Soundgarden, and more, they were quickly becoming the central focus of the late 80s indie rock scene. Nirvana had found a comfortable home. There was one catch, though. Or 50. The most obvious being that Sub Pop didn't do contracts, so Nirvana signing with them in May was mostly symbolic. Factor in that their company was often on the verge of bankruptcy, and Poneman once called Kurt trying to borrow $200, and this quickly became more of a shitty friendship than a professional arrangement. Still, after the fruits of their first partnership, Love Buzz, sold remarkably well, Poneman let Kurt know that the label would be willing to distribute a full album. This was great news. It was what Cobain had wanted all along, but again, there was a catch. Nirvana had to cover the recording costs. Yeah, that's not normal. Still, it was a dream come true for the band, and while they did a few shows in December, all to great fanfare, it was mostly a month of hardcore practicing. By the end of the year, they pretty much had the whole album planned out, except for one bit: the lyrics. Don't worry, just most of them. Kurt pieced together a lot of it the night before they started recording, handling the rest on the drive to the studio. And although many fans and critics have tried to attribute some meaning to Kurt's shrieks on this album, to quote the man himself, not much thought went into them at all. Nirvana's first session for their first album was held on Christmas Eve, and while it laid a pretty strong foundation for the project, most progress would be made the following year, 1989. Studio time aside, the band knew this was going to be another big year, mostly because they were finally finished getting pushed around by Sub Pop. That's right, they, meaning Chris, because Kurt was scared, marched right down to Bruce Pavitt's house, banged on his door, and demanded a contract. Bruce, likely intimidated, accepted and drafted one up which guaranteed the band a steady stream of income and albums. It was entirely positive, it went into effect January 1st, 1989, and the band would never regret it. Everything was going the way we wanted it to. It was cool. I think those were the best times. May have been for them too. I don't know. The album was finished on January 24th, 1989, and high on their many successes at this point and some other things, Nirvana decided to embark on their first proper tour. They kept their ambitions in check, hugging the West Coast and performing just a week of shows, but as would soon prove to be a pattern with the band's early tours, the further they got from home, the worse they were received. More demoralizing was the fact that Nirvana was touring with Kurt's idols, the Melvins, and even they weren't a big enough draw to bring people to their shows. With obviously no support from Sub Pop, this meant they were hemorrhaging money. Gas, shelter, food, it was getting scarce. As Nirvana biographer Charles Cross put it, there were 7 people in the band's entourage, and among them, they couldn't afford a burrito. Desperate, they found a local soup kitchen. But Kurt couldn't stomach one bite. It was a massive ego check, and just a few days after they returned from the disastrous tour, Nirvana became a 4-piece. Is there any correlation between these two events? Well, their new 4th member was guitarist Jason Everman, a friend of Chad's who had paid for Nirvana's first album. Just the whole thing. Kurt says Jason was there to thicken up the sound, but his having lots of money from an old commercial fishing job surely didn't hurt. Finally, in June of 1989, Nirvana's first album was released. Originally, they were looking to call it Too Many Humans, but an AIDS poster Kurt saw on the band's West Coast tour changed his tune. The album was titled Bleach. It first went on sale the day of Subpop's Lame Fest, where after Nirvana's set, Cobain witnessed a long line of new fans waiting to buy his album. Bleach was a success. The band's expectations weren't high, but that meant they were met quickly. It was a Sub Pop record made for Sub Pop fans, bought by Sub Pop fans. In the words of Kurt, "We purposely made that record one-dimensional, more rock than it should have been." He added, "We wanted to try to please people at first, to see what would happen." And the people were pleased. To commemorate and promote this most monumental of milestones, Nirvana embarked on their first US tour, paid by, you guessed it, Old Jason. He wasn't exactly Daddy Warbucks, though. The band slept in their tour van and only lived in as much luxury as their fudge pack and t-shirt sales could afford them. Still, it was an immeasurably better tour than their last one. Even with the shrinking fanfare the further east they went, their shows were incredible at best and good learning experiences at worst. Better yet, the intimacy of the band brought Kurt, Krist, and Chad closer than ever. This was the tour that cemented them as a trio. Us against the world, as Chad put it. Oh hey, Jason. Jason Everman did not fit in. He was quiet, sullen, distant, he slept with groupies, he headbanged, he was so posy I couldn't believe it. True, Kurt was guilty of pretty much all these same sins except for the groupie thing, but he was the frontman. He had to be weird, it's part of the job. Jason was new and disposable, so 2 weeks before the tour was set to finish, Kurt decided the guitarist was out of the band. How did he go about firing Jason? Well, this is where Kurt's genius really shined. He told the band the tour was over. Then, they packed everything up, drove 3,000 miles back home in silence, and never spoke to Jason ever again. After a certain point, you gotta respect Kurt's commitment to non-confrontation. Now back home, Cobain sought a remedy for his second biggest touring pain, the one in his stomach. Kurt's tummy had first started tormenting him back in 1987, but it was during the summer of 1989 that it became impossible to ignore. For the first time, he was forced to seek medical help, all of it coming back inconclusive. There were more tests available at the time, but he refused to take them. Why? They wanted to take some blood, and I hate needles, so I left. Foreshadowing aside, the present was defined by the recording of a new EP. It was the Blue EP. That's not an EP, and this joke is forced. Get out, don't want ya, get out, shoot. Although featuring the soon-to-be iconic Been a Son and Polly, as well as a top 40 drum sound that Kurt fought hard for, the EP would be best remembered for the now infamous European tour it kicked off. It fucking sucked. Nirvana's first European tour was such a disaster, it probably deserves its own video. It was shared with Tad, fronted by the 300-pound Tad Doyle, which was abnormal in the 90s. Then there were Tad's 3 other members, the 3 remaining Nirvana boys, including 6'7" Krist, as well as 4 roadies, and both bands' equipment in one tiny Fiat van. Kurt Cobain had high hopes for this tour. Sub Pop was slowly taking off on the continent. Bleach had been well received in the UK, and generally speaking, Europe is just more receptive to up-and-coming talent than the US. But this was just never meant to be. 37 shows, 42 days, 9 countries, van, Tad, Oh yeah, don't think I'm a dick for repeatedly mentioning Tad. He's a sticking point in any recollection of this story. Tad Doyle would vomit and diarrhea constantly, like every half hour. Most of the time, they couldn't even find a bathroom, so he'd just do it on the side of the road. It was funny, but not fun. The tour reached rock bottom 5 weeks in at a show in Rome. Although their work was paying off and Bleach was really starting to make an impact on the European indie charts, the band was hungry, tired, and uncomfortable. And that's when Jonathan Poneman and Bruce Pavitt decided to pay them a visit. There's Tad and Nirvana riding around in this crummy little van, and here come the moguls flying into Rome. We thought we were lending emotional support, but from their perspective, I can see them thinking, these arrogant sons of bitches. That Rome show went terribly. Without getting too deep into the weeds of it, Bruce Pavitt described Kurt's behavior on stage as a nervous breakdown. He threatened to hurt himself, hurt others, and eventually he hurt some equipment. Afterwards, the frontman notified everyone that he was abandoning the tour, then burst into tears. Poneman took Kurt for a walk, but it did little to soothe his nerves or his resolve. That night, he decided to leave Sub Pop. Nirvana returned home in December, and Kurt took the month to recuperate mentally. 1989 was massive for the band. To put it in perspective, according to Live Nirvana, from their formation to the end of 1988, the band had only played 33 shows. In 1989 alone, they played 82. January of 1990 marked 1 year since the band's contract with Sub Pop went into effect, which meant it was time to start working on a new album. Although they were able to get one studio session done by April of 1990, their first time working with the ever-talented Butch Vig, it was clear their label was slowing them down. This time, the issue stemmed less from disrespect or distrust, and more from mismanagement. Sub Pop had officially gone from broke to dead broke. They simply couldn't afford to pay for Nirvana's next album. Hell, they couldn't even afford to promote their last album. The fact that the band got any interviews or Bleach sold any copies was a miracle stemming exclusively from the quality of their music. Even other Sub Pop bands were taking notice of the injustice. Matt Lukin explained, "I saw how long Bruce had been promising to put out another record for them, and he kept putting them off. They got put on the back burner." Soon, Kurt's impulsive internal decision to leave Sub Pop became very external. The rest of the band agreed, and again, Krist was the one to deliver the final word to the label. It was over. Now, this would have been a very simple and straightforward matter for any other band working with Sub Pop. You just walk away. But Nirvana had one thing they didn't: a contract. You remember the contract, right? You remember how I said the band would never regret it?
I lied.
Now they couldn't just run off and partner with another indie label. They needed a major label to buy them out of Sub Pop. Luckily, the band had more clout now than they did when Kurt was spamming tapes a year prior. Finding the right label would be less about begging and more about bargaining. This was not only because of the band's steadily growing dedicated fanbase all across the Northwest, but because their music was evolving. Much to the horror of those on the more stuck-up side of the indie scene, Kurt was starting to write songs that were, gulp, catchy. I had finally got to the point where I was mixing pop music and the heavy side of us in the right formula. It was working really well, mostly because of the reports from our friends in other bands. Everyone was saying that it was really good. I could tell that it was definitely more advanced than Bleach. There was a weak link in the chain though, and his name was Chad. Now Nirvana's drummer for 2 years, he felt comfortable enough to start pitching his own music for the band's newest album. Kurt and Krist did not appreciate that. Mostly Kurt. Plus, it didn't help that the frontman was really starting to tire of Chad's drumming by this point. It came down to 2 recurring complaints. He really had bad timing, and he wasn't a very powerful drummer. The founding members decided the time had finally come to give Chad the boot. But again, this breakup wouldn't be so easy. As I mentioned, Channing had been in the band for 2 years at this point, pretty much since they formed in earnest. He wasn't just some local schmuck goober they could ghost, he was their friend. So, maybe for that reason alone, this was the first time Kurt actually broke the news himself. I felt like I'd just killed somebody. Chad felt like he had just quit the band. Good for you, Chad. Kurt also took this sudden wave of change as an excuse to leave another struggling relationship, the one with his girlfriend Tracy Miranda. Truthfully, I probably should have mentioned her more than just one other time in this video. They were together for 3 years, and much of what we know about Kurt comes from interviews with her. Fucking About a Girl was written about her. But hey, I had to fit in that Tad Doyle diarrhea anecdote, so sorry, Tracy. Kurt started dating fellow musician Toby Vale soon after, and she would soon leave a much more obvious footprint on Nirvana. 1990 was a pretty messy year compared to 1989. The band had no definitive drummer and no definitive label. So most of the year revolved around solving those problems while performing whenever possible. That meant a lot of meetings with lawyers, awkward encounters with A&R representatives, and a couple of temp drummers. Finally, near the end of the year, the band would find 2 remedies. The first was drummer Dave Grohl. I made a whole video about Dave's time with Nirvana, but to summarize, Grohl had been performing as drummer for the band Scream since he was 17. He had already toured the US and Europe several times by September of 1990, when the band's bassist suddenly quit, leaving Scream in limbo. Luckily, Dave had made plenty of connections in the indie scene, including a friendship with the Melvins' Buzz Osborne. Buzz told Dave about Nirvana, Dave called Krist, and after one audition, he was in. We knew in 2 minutes that he was the right drummer. He was a hard hitter, he was really dynamic, he was so bright, so hot, so vital, he rocked. Dave quickly moved into Kurt's Olympia apartment, and for a while they lived happily together. Grohl would wash the frontman's clothes, teach him how to tattoo himself, shoot BBs with him, graffiti the apartment walls with him. They weren't exactly best friends. Dave later described a lot of the time as totally silent, but they got along. There's even a famous story from this time when Kurt and Toby Vale started going on double dates with Dave and his then girlfriend Kathleen Hanna. In an attempt to mock Cobain, Kathleen took a Sharpie to the wall of his bedroom writing, "Kurt smells like Teen Spirit." She was trying to make reference to the deodorant brand used by Toby Vale, saying Kurt smelled like her, thus mocking the two of them for, engaging in... Hold on, let me use a Nirvana-themed analogy for this. No, absolutely not. No, ew, no. Fine, love buzzing. However, Kurt would later insist that he had no idea about the deodorant brand and just thought it was a weird compliment. Basically, it was a fun good time for everyone. Until Toby dumped Kurt. In hindsight, it was obviously coming. For all of Cobain's punk tendencies, he was at his core a deeply monogamous guy. He had 3 relationships in his entire life and hardly ever slept around. It often made him stand out in the artsy circles of Olympia, where the word girlfriend was frowned upon. And Toby fit the Olympia stereotype pretty well, always rejecting the title. Nevertheless, the breakup hit him hard, arguably harder than anything in his life so far. He spiraled into a period of deep depression and self-hatred. The writings in his journal became incomprehensible ramblings, his artwork grew more disturbing, and the music he wrote was more personal. Aneurysm, Drain You, Lounge Act, a rewrite of Lithium, and most notably Smells Like Teen Spirit all came in the months following the breakup, all with themes and lyrics tied to Toby. Something else came in the months following the breakup as well, something less constructive. Heroin. It's hard to talk about subjects like these on YouTube because they still enforce the Hays Code, so I literally need to tell you not to do drugs. Don't do drugs. Kurt Cobain did drugs, lots of them. He even claimed to have tried the Big H back in Aberdeen soon after high school, a fact I referenced in my previous video on the band that was mostly refuted by his friends and family. Kurt had a lifelong fear of needles, and he often treated his use of the drug in November of 1990 as a new experience to anyone he told about it. The first person he did tell was Krist, and although Kurt promised never to do it again, the bassist was no less disapproving. I remember literally telling him that he was playing with dynamite. Dynamite or no, Cobain would break his promise frequently. The Big H would become a permanent fixture in the life of the frontman. This would have been the most defining moment of November of 1990, if not for a breakthrough. Nirvana signed to a major label. By this point, there had been A&R representatives from all over the country swooning over them like desperate lovers for months. As I mentioned previously, Nirvana was becoming a hot commodity in the indie scene, especially with the rise of alternative rock making any record executive with half a brain see dollar signs. But the band was wise beyond their years. They knew better than to sign with the first chump that paid for their dinner. So they waited till the right moment. They were inches away from signing with Charisma Records when at the last second, they pivoted to DGC. Short for the David Geffen Company, it was an offshoot of Geffen Records, which at this point had a reputation for giving bands like Sonic Youth the creative freedom Kurt was seeking. At the end of the day, the contract finally got Nirvana off of Subpop, awarding the former label $75,000 and 2% of the sales from Nirvana's next 2 albums. Ironically, saving Subpop. More presently, the contract paid Nirvana a $287,000 advance for their next album. $287,000. $87,000. Adjusted for inflation, $651,727. Due to some legal chicanery, the band saw very little of this money, but that didn't really matter. It was a message that the music industry was sending. A year and a half prior, a journalist for Melody Maker wrote that if Nirvana weren't doing this, they would be working in a supermarket or lumber yard or fixing cars. These were regular guys, with a history so short it's been summarized in 2 20-minute videos. And DGC paid them $250,000. Something big was coming. A chapter beyond anything Nirvana could have possibly imagined. But that's a story for another day. If you liked the video, like the video. If you liked me, subscribe. I have more videos, so you should watch those videos. Thank you. I'd like to give a special thanks to Michael Azerrad, Charles Cross, and Carrie Borzillo. Their books, Come As You Are, Heavier Than Heaven, and Kurt Cobain the Nirvana Years, were the main sources for this video, and without their hard work, this would have been a 20-minute dumpster fire. Go buy and read those books. I'm gonna leave now. Goodbye.